Red Dead Redemption 2 is one of the most impressive games I have ever played. A team of around 2,000 people put their blood, sweat and tears and untold hours of unlivable crunch into the creation of this game, which cost $500 million to make. I still haven't beat Red Dead Redemption 2, but it's on my mind a lot. I don't think there will ever be a more convincing simulation of the Wild West era in the art form, at least not until Rockstar make a sequel. Lots of people hold Red Dead 2 close as one of their favourite games, and the game's predecessor, Red Dead Redemption, is also highly regarded by millions, but there is a third game in the Red Dead series, the red-headed stepchild of this massive franchise that seems to have been lost with time. A game that bears the same name as its sequels, but one that differentiates itself in tone, setting and gameplay. That game would be Red Dead Revolver. Hey, I'm Heather, and welcome to Retro Relapse. Red Dead Revolver is a 2004 action game published by Rockstar Games and developed by... It's complicated. Red Dead Revolver started its life at Capcom, being developed by Angel Studios, who had previously developed Resident Evil 2's remarkable Nintendo 64 port. The team were approached by Yoshiki Okamoto, a longtime Capcom developer who worked on titles such as Final Fight and Street Fighter 2, to make a spiritual successor to his 1985 shoot-'em-up Gun.Smoke. Development started on Red Dead Revolver in the year 2000. The development of the game was, by all accounts, a complete shit show. Despite Capcom announcing the game in 2002, Angel Studios would be bought by Rockstar in November of that year, being renamed to Rockstar San Diego. Dan Houser himself took a particular interest in the game despite the fact that the game was in a completely unplayable state, despite having been in development for over 2 years at this point. The original Red Dead Revolver was cancelled by Capcom in 2003 after Okamoto left the company, and suddenly it seemed like the game would never see the light of day. Luckily Rockstar, who already wanted to make a Western game, bought the rights to Red Dead Revolver and managed to put it in a playable state where it launched in May 2004. Red Dead Revolver was released to mixed reviews, with some critics lauding its style and the uniqueness of the Wild West setting, while some just couldn't bring themselves to overlook the flaws and jagged edges of the game, resulting in a 73 on Metacritic. I first played Red Dead Revolver with my brother when it came out, and I have lukewarm memories of it, I think. I was a big fan of Western stuff as a kid. I have distinct memories of sitting with my gran and watching old Western films, so it seemed like I'd be the prime audience for this kind of thing, but I just couldn't quite get into it as a kid. I remember the shooting feeling really weird and floaty, and there not really being much to keep the game interesting. Red Dead Revolver makes an interesting first impression. The main menu theme here is great and wonderfully stylized. It kinda gives me the vibes of those old Medal of Honor games. There's a grainy noise filter as you're in what looks to be an old dusty cabin as a scorpion crawls across the table. It's great atmospheric stuff. Go into the options menu and find nothing in particular, create a profile and call it Shagger because you're one of the cool kids, and then get ready to start your rootin' tootin' adventure in the Wild West. You play as Red, who lives a pretty decent life on a farm with his mum and dad. His dad returns from a trip talking about how they've struck oil and they're all going to be filthy stinking rich. Your dad gives you a gun and tells you to go practice shooting down by the river. You 360 no-scope some pots and pans before your little house is raided by bandits and your parents are killed right in front of you. The young Red swears revenge on the men who murdered his family. So yeah, it's that story. The kind of story you put together when your tragic backstory concept was due in 10 minutes ago. Red Dead Revolver never really ventures outside the realm of Western cliches, which is fine. You'll encounter a train robbery, a woman at risk of her ranch being repossessed by an evil governor, bar fights and more. It's very much a greatest hits compilation of spaghetti western nonsense. It all feels very familiar, which is good for setting the scene, but the actual story beats and the characters themselves are half-baked at best. There is eventually a story about a rogue general and evil governor and Red's revenge, but it's also very hard to care about. You meet a cast of characters, some of whom you can count their lines on 2 hands with fingers to spare, but we're still expected to care about. Some of these poor bastards don't even have names. You don't even get a proper plot point until about 10 levels in. Before that, you're just bounty hunting for a giggle and then all of a sudden the plot is happening. And even when the plot does happen, it's never very interesting for very long. By far the biggest flaw with Red Dead Revolver's story is the constant tonal shifts in the throwaway characters. The start of the game, as cliche as it may be, does kind of set a tone. It's a revenge story, a son taking revenge on the man who murdered his family and robbed him of his youth. It's a very specific tone, and then the game throws goofy shit at you, like this dynamite guy called Pig Josh or this magician fella and whatever the fuck this guy's face is doing. You never really stay on one story beat for too long until the very last levels of the game. As far as I can tell, the game is trying to do a sort of Tarantino-esque ensemble where we'd follow the viewpoints of many different people, some minor, some major, as we lead up to a finale of the main characters taking down the big bad, but it just does not work. You play as Red for a while and you're doing bounty hunter stuff for a sheriff, and it's all played straight. Then you're this English trick shooter fella fighting a magician and his army of knife-ruling dwarves. And then you're a woman trying to stop a barrage of enemies from assaulting her ranch. Then you play as a person of colour for like 2 levels and they're never named, and they, spoiler warning for Red Dead Revolver, die in the next cutscene. Then you play as a Native American guy for a token stealth level, and at some point I have to wonder if they really had a concrete idea for what this game was going to be. And well, not really, as it turns out. It turns out that a lot of the really weird stuff came from the Capcom days, back when the game was significantly more arcadey and goofy, like a Capcom game I guess. Come to think of it, this does seem like baby's first god hand, so it would seem that Red Dead Revolver is actually a really weird mishmash of ideas that Capcom had and then Rockstar finished. And as a result, the storyline and overall structure of Red Dead Revolver comes across as disjointed, muddled, and therefore almost impossible to care about. But it becomes apparent early on that Red Dead Revolver is more about the aesthetics of Western stereotypes rather than a coherent storyline, and that really shows in the audiovisual design. Okay, so before I talk about the graphics, I really need to get this out of my system. Listen, lads, please, for the love of God, just add a drop shadow to this text. When your text and the saturated backgrounds are almost the exact same colour, you know something's gone really wrong. Red Dead Revolver has a very clear sense of style, or at least an idea of what it wants that style to be. The colours are very washed out and there's a lovely film grain filter over everything. They're clearly going for the aesthetic of old Sergio Leone spaghetti western flicks, and that's fine. I'm always up for that. But there is something to be said for how fuck ugly everything in this game looks. Some of the environments are nice, with some nice atmospheric vistas to look at, but oh my god, the state of these character models. The models of the main characters are fine and all. Red looks a little bit PS1 haggard, but nobody's perfect. But a lot of these enemies barely look human. There are some characters later in the game who just like, Jesus Christ, what is wrong with you and how can we make it stop? A lot of the game's style is also hampered by the limits of the PS2 hardware, and while I don't want to be mean to the game for that, it looks very, well, shit in a lot of places. Like, these intro cutscenes where Red goes all revolver ocelot with his guns, I can totally see what they were going for here, and in theory I like it, but it just looks so ugly. And I do genuinely hate riffing on old games for their graphics, because I draw a clear distinction between something that looks old and something that looks bad. Take something like Final Fantasy X for example. Yeah, it doesn't have the same graphical fidelity as Cyberpunk 1690 or whatever, but are we really going to look at these cutscenes and say they look bad? Of course not. It's great, but then you look at Red Dead Revolver and you see how bulky and awkward everything looks, and how awful these faces. I mean, look at this guy, the actual fucking state of him. There are plenty of PS2 games that look great and stand the test of time, and I'm afraid Red Dead Revolver isn't one of them. What does hold up better, however, is the audio design. While the voice acting is, I mean, yeah, the sound effects are so kitsch and gauche that I actually grew to love them over the course of my playthrough. Most of the sound effects are basically just the sounds of pistols firing, and it's just so charming. It also helps that the actual sound effects of guns going off during firefights also sounds exactly as you'd expect. Did you ever have those toy guns as a kid? The ones with like the wee sound effects when you pull the trigger? Every gun in Red Dead Revolver is one of those toy guns, and I adore that so much. It adds to the overall goofy vibe of the whole game, and it feels weirdly nostalgic in some ways. After a century of cowboy films, this is exactly what I expected these gunfights to sound like, and I'm all for it. And the soundtrack is pretty great as well. It features licensed tracks from various western films that inspired it, including some by Ennio Morricone himself. If you don't know who that is, yes you do, it's this guy. But the audiovisual presentation is only half of what makes the game enjoyable. What about the gameplay? Well, it's there. The game starts with you down by the river shooting bottles and pots and pans, and this is where you realise just how arcadey Red Dead Revolver actually is. Shooting is fairly straightforward. Aim with L1 and fire with R1, not much unique here. You're given a variety of guns, with most of them being either 6-shooters or a rifle, with the occasional shotgun or thrown weapon in there too. Red can take advantage of a fairly rudimentary cover system that doesn't really work in a lot of fights, but it's nice to have. Aside from the ranged weapons, there are a few melee weapons, but they don't really see much use unless the shit really hits the fan. The one big innovation Red Revolver brought to the table was the concept of Deadeye. So, you know that part in the western films where two characters have a duel and it's really intense staring contest to see who can shoot first? Well, this game tries to gamify that, and it is excellent. It's more or less a version of Max Payne Bullet Time, but it allows you to line up shots that will be taken once you leave Deadeye, and it's just so good. As far as I can tell, Red Dead Revolver Digital was the first game to have this feature. It has since become a mainstay in pretty much every western shooter game, from Redemption to Gun to Juarez. This is the one major mechanic that Revolver started that is still going to this day. As you rack up kills and on-target shots, you'll accumulate cash with a multiplier next to it. This shows how many points you have. These points will be converted into cash at the end of a level, so high-skilled players will be rewarded with higher amounts of cash. What can you spend that cash on? Well, not much at all really. You can purchase new guns of course, and that's always fun, but apart from that you can buy little collectibles which flesh out the world. To a non-insignificant extent actually. This is where the bulk of the story, flavour and character development is. It's nice to have all this stuff, and it's certainly better than nothing I guess. But I do still think that if you need an in-game encyclopedia to explain what makes your world and characters interesting, then something has went horribly wrong. Oh, and you can also buy showdown characters and stages. The showdown mode is the only other extra game mode, and it's a fairly standard battle mode. It's nothing great, but it's nice to have I guess. There isn't a whole lot of variety in the missions themselves either. Most of the missions are fairly straightforward A to B slogs where you shoot everything that moves. There is some level variety, like the one stealth level where you play as the Native American guy, or that one level where you get a horse and chase a train, which is really fun. Outside of that though, it's mostly just straight shooting, and that's not necessarily a bad thing of course. Lots of games are just shooting, or just racing, or just mediocre. It would be weird to chastise Burnout Revenge for being just racing, or Fear for being just shooting, but those games all perfected their key concepts to the point where nothing else was really needed. Teddy Roosevelt, however, does not have gunplay which is fun or interesting enough to carry the whole game. I mean, I guess there are these Gatling gun segments, but they're so hard to control and so sensitive that I honestly thought my controller was breaking, so they don't really do much to ease the misery of the game's 27 levels. It also doesn't help that there's very little consistency with enemy health. Sometimes the enemy will go down in 2 shots to the torso, other times you can sit around and just pile headshots into the guy and he won't even bat an eyelid. Levels are usually capped off with a boss fight or 3, and they usually have some unique tactics required to beat them, but it's nothing too difficult and none of them really gave me much trouble on their own. All of the bosses have names like in a fighting game or whatever, and this is nice, and they're usually at least a little fleshed out by the journal pages, although I had to laugh by the time I was straight up having a boss fight with a stagecoach, and there's also just like a boss fight with a train. Such contempt for the railways hasn't been seen since the John Major government. What's even funnier is that the bounty screen at the end of a level will have things like "Wanted, Pig Josh," and sometimes they don't really have a bounty enemy, so they'll just include the architecture from the level, like, yeah, fuck that bridge in particular. Even when Red Dead Revolver threatens to be fun for like 20 minutes, there's always something stopping it from getting there. Take this level where you have a bar fight, classic western stuff, and it's similarly chaotic, and I was having a good time here even though it's pretty janky. But then 2 seconds later you're having this boss fight which literally does not work as intended. It's a bitch and a hassle. Or this bridge level where we meet this cryptid. It feels like a fun tower defense level at first, but then you get smacked around the face with homing cannonballs and friendly AI that would make Daikatana blush. But there's one little nugget of brilliance in here. One little shining light that really got me invested in Red Dead Revolver. And those are the intermission sections. Sometimes between levels you'll be given some time to piss about in the town of Brimstone, a quaint little frontier town with all the bells and whistles you'd expect from a western town. You've got a bustling main street full of pedestrians talking about the goings on of the world, a gun shop, and of course a saloon filled with old men and scantily clad barmaids. These levels are enough, just enough, to break the boredom of the main levels and actually get you invested in the setting. And it's weird how these are by far the best parts of the game. Nothing really happens here, save from a few showdown levels late in the game, but they're by far the most evocative of the setting. You can just go chill at the saloon and do nothing in particular, or walk down the streets and chat with the locals or buy some unlockables. It's nice. It's genuinely the best part of the game. It's also where you can see some of the seeds for Drop Dead Redemption getting planted. And really that's the best way to look at Red Dead Revolver. As a sort of initial pitch for Red Dead Redemption, many of the ideas that started in this game would carry on through Redemption and its sequel. It's weird to think that one of the best-selling, most profitable pieces of art ever actually got its start as this weird little Capcom game. And isn't that just so charming? So, should you play Red Dead Revolver? You can probably give this one a miss. All in all, it's not a very good game. The combat is boring, the tone shifts are so sudden that it makes it hard to actually get invested in anything, and some of these character models would have looked dated in the Dreamcast era. But still, as I always say, there's something to be gained from every game that you play, good or bad. If all you want is a good way to spend an evening, just stick to the Redemption games. But if you want to see how this mega franchise got its start, and if you want to see the game that introduced many gameplay systems that would go on to define the Western video game genre, then you probably need to play Red Dead Revolver. Hey, thanks for watching! If you liked this video, be sure to like, comment and subscribe, follow me on Twitter and Twitch, and join my Discord. I'm Heather, and I'll catch you later.